All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to continue our festival of screencast about World War II. Hooray! Yay! Welcome back. I hope you enjoy our time together. All right. Sorry for the awkwardness. All right. Anyways, here we go. So we left off on Friday in class talking about the Japanese internment. You'll notice that you have a homework assignment that will be due Tuesday. You can turn it in Monday if you would like to. You can turn it in on an Edmodo. You can do type it up on an Edmodo, type it up and print it, however you would like to. But in any case, it's due by Tuesday morning. Okay. So we're going to continue on talking about now that the Americans are fully involved in the war. Okay. We're going to look at North Africa and Europe first. So the Battle of the Atlantic is kind of like the general term for basically all the naval stuff going on between 1940 and 1944, and mainly what's going on is kind of like in World War I when we were sending troops or sending supplies to the British to help them out. We were doing the same thing with the British in World War II. And remember, we talked about them basically being the sole people that were fighting against the Nazis for a bulk of the war here. And so we're basically trying to help them without getting involved in the war. The Battle of Britain is basically a series of air battles over England. I think I talked about briefly in class how the Nazis wanted to invade England, and they had a whole plan for it and everything like that, and it was called Operation Sea Lion. Well, the goal was to basically go in and bomb England and all of the industrial bases and try to weaken them before the invasion. Well, there was basically it failed. The invasion never took place because the skies over England were never secured for the Nazis. In Africa, the Nazis wanted to, and the Italians too, wanted to basically get control of the Suez Canal, which was the canal that basically links the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and would allow them to link up with the Japanese. They also wanted to try to get into the Middle East to control the oil fields, which would give them a lot of access to, more oil for their mechanized troops. Most of the battles were fought between the Italians and Germans together against the British. Later on, we get involved, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Kind of the turning point of this is in November of 1942. The British turned back a big Axis offensive into Egypt and basically secure Egypt and the Suez Canal and keep them from getting to the oil fields. And right along the same time, the Americans invade North Africa over on the western coast. So there's big battles going on in Egypt, which is like far eastern part of North Africa, and then we basically come into the far western part, and so now we've kind of got the Germans and the Italians pinched between us, and basically from here on we're basically pushing them back and then forcing them eventually out of North Africa, and then we can invade into Europe. At El Alamein, the main British general is Bernard Montgomery, and the main German general for pretty much all of the African fighting is Erwin Rommel. His nickname was a Desert Fox. Very, very intelligent man, very good leader, but ultimately he can't get enough supplies from the Nazis, nor enough support from the Italians, and is basically eventually forced out of Africa. He's actually later executed for theoretically trying to assassinate Hitler towards the end of the war. There's never really been proof about his involvement in the assassination attempt, but nevertheless he is executed for it. And Dwight Eisenhower is the main American commander in North Africa, and then later on into Europe as well with George Patton. Okay, so some photographs. It's Bernard Montgomery, Erwin Rommel. He's got a sweet baton. I think he was just running track before this. He was in the 4x400, I think. No, he was not. I'm kidding. All right, European battles. So now they are out of Africa and they are basically advancing into Europe now. On the Eastern Front is basically the fighting between the Soviets and the Nazis. So the Russians against the Nazis. All right. June 22nd, 1941, in violation of a previous treaty. Surprise, surprise, you can't trust Adolf Hitler at his word. No way, that's hard to believe, isn't it? He decides to invade the Soviet Union. Everything's going so well for him, for the most part, in Europe, and he's kind of taken over pretty much all of Europe, that he decides to stab Stalin in the back and go after the Soviet Union. And in the winter of 42 and 43, a big battle is at Stalingrad, and basically the Nazis have a lot of hard times there because, well, it's winter and Russia. Not the best time to be fighting in Russia, and basically it's the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, and from that point on, the Nazis are pushed back and pushed back and pushed back by the Soviets, and they're just kind of overwhelmed by the sheer number of Russian Soviets that are involved in the war. There's a really good movie about the battle at Stalingrad. It's fictional, but it's still pretty good. I think it's called Enemy at the Gates. It's an older movie, maybe 15 years old or something like that, but it's a pretty good movie. Enemy at the Gates. Another battle, August of 1943 at Kursk. Joseph Stalin, who I've already mentioned here a couple of times, he's the dictator of the Soviet Union, and their government is communism, which we'll talk about quite a bit with the Cold War, which is going to be our next unit. So in the Western Front, that is basically the Americans and the British fighting against the Nazis. So, like we already mentioned, November 1942, the Allies invade North Africa, and from that point on, the Nazis are basically reeling, and they're basically being pushed further and further out of North Africa, along with the Italians. And then in September of 43, the United States mostly is responsible for this, invades Italy, and basically bowls over Italy pretty quick. There's a lot of pretty good fighting in Anzio and Sicily, but the Italians were not nearly as mechanized and advanced and disciplined as the troops for the Nazis were, and so pretty quickly the Allies are able to take back Italy, and Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, is executed in 1945 along with his wife. And then basically throughout 42 and 40 through 45, we are bombing Germany pretty much nonstop, and you saw that in the video where they were talking about the new bombing sites, the Norton bombing sites. They were used to basically target specific buildings, and it was a really basic computer, but it did a really good job of guiding those bombs and those bombers towards important sites. So basically we weaken them with all the bombing, and we eliminate one of their allies, the Italians, and so June 6, 1944, we invade German-occupied France in Normandy. This is D-Day. You kind of saw some of that in that video as well, where they're storming the beaches and the Germans are up in the sand dunes basically and on the cliffs, and they've got these concrete bunkers, and all kinds of chaos ensues, but it basically gets us a point where we can unload lots and lots of troops and use those troops and those weapons to basically fight against the Germans. And within about a month we have almost 1 million troops in France. Later on that same year, in December of 44, right around Christmas time, is a really famous battle called the Battle of the Bulge. Basically, we had pushed the Germans back pretty much all the way back to their borders. I mean, we were really close. Within that 6-month time period, we had basically retaken all of France, and we're pushing through Belgium, and we're basically almost up to the border. Well, the Nazis, as a last-ditch effort to try to prevent the Americans from getting any further, they concentrate all their forces in this one part of Belgium and do this massive attack and basically cause a bulge in the line. And in that time period, there were troops that were in kind of near a little town called Bastogne, and they were paratroopers, and they got isolated, basically completely surrounded, and they did not have winter equipment or anything like that, and they were freezing. And it was a really, really bad winter. I'll show you some photographs here in a little bit, but they were able to hold off until they could get some support from some army, from some tanks. Later on, Roosevelt dies in that spring, and Harry Truman, his vice president, becomes the new president. And then also in April, Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, 1945, and basically then the Nazi army kind of falls apart, and within a few days they surrender, May 7th. Hooray. And May 8th is declared VE Day. It's Victory in Europe Day. There's all kinds of celebrating throughout the United States. And so now we've only got to focus on one enemy, Japan. So some photographs. Stalin, communist dictator of Soviet Union. Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was a general but later becomes president of the United States. There's another one of Bernard Montgomery. There's George Patton. He was American general in the European fighting. Some of the pictures of Battle of Stalingrad, you can see how destroyed the buildings were. This is D-Day photographs. You can see them storming the beaches. The Germans would have been all over the place up in here with concrete bunkers and machine guns and all kinds of craziness. Kind of get a feel for what they were going into. Pretty horrifying. So here's the Battle of the Bulge, just what I was talking about, where the guys get isolated. Super cold winter. I mean, ridiculous amounts of snow. Really cold, and the guys were pretty well isolated, a long way from any kind of support. Pretty rough, pretty rough. More Battle of the Bulge. There's Mussolini and his wife, or his mistress, I guess you'd say, having been executed. Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler. And Hitler dead. And there's Harry Truman, who takes command of the United States after Roosevelt dies. Okay, real quick, we're going to try to get through some of these Japanese battles. Alright, so in the Philippines, the series of islands off the coast of Southeast Asia, basically there's a lot of battles going on between December of 41 and May of 42. Basically when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they attacked a lot of different places that same day throughout the Pacific, and one of the places they attacked was the Philippines. And basically the Americans got isolated. You know, they're on islands, they're cut off, and you know, we talked about their navy being destroyed in Pearl Harbor, so they didn't really have any way to rescue very many of the people. And so a lot of them got captured by the Japanese, and we already talked about how the Japanese did not treat their prisoners very well. So a lot of the Americans that got captured ended up being killed or died of starvation, that kind of thing. But basically later on we go back in and capture the Philippines from the Japanese later on. Nimitz, who is basically the American naval commander in the Pacific, pretty famous guy. In fact, the name, I can't remember if it's Nimitz class of submarine or aircraft carrier. I think it's aircraft carriers that are still named after him today. Excuse me. MacArthur was the American Army commander. He was on the Philippines. He was able to get off the islands, but he is able to return and take them back. Battle of Midway is a big naval and air battle over a tiny little set of islands. They call it Midway. It's kind of midway between Japan and Hawaii. It's a little bit closer to Hawaii than it is to Japan, but in any case, they called it Midway, and the United States wins. And basically, it's kind of like the turning point of the Pacific because the Japanese lose a lot of planes and a lot of their big ships. There's a really cool video that History Channel put out a couple years ago called Battle 360, and it's about Midway. It's computer generated animations, and it's really well done. It's pretty cool. It's called Battle 360 Midway. Guadalcanal, small island, basically kind of off the coast of Australia. It's kind of the closest place that you guys would probably know, but it's kind of off the coast of Australia. Still a pretty good ways from Australia, but nevertheless, the Americans invade, and this was a big battle for the Marine Corps. Some really tough fighting, brutal fighting. The Japanese had, throughout all these island battles that we'll talk about from here on, had dug all kinds of tunnel systems and built all kinds of kind of like trench systems throughout all the different islands, and so they were able to get from one place to another place without ever having come above the ground. So it's really brutal fighting throughout the Pacific, and totally different style than what they faced in the European theater. And so the goal of the Americans was to do what they called island hopping, going from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, and taking them all back from Japan and basically collapsing in on the main islands of Japan. So they were basically taking back island from island so they could get closer to Japan, so they could establish bombers and fighter planes that could go to Japan and bomb them. And basically, the closer we got, the more powerful we had, the more power we had over the Japanese to continue bombing them. Another battle